Here comes Critigri, the comic reviewer without fear. That's not true. I have generalized anxiety disorder. How's it going, everyone? I just read my first Marvel Epic Collection. It is Daredevil, Volume 8, I just had to go check that, to Daredevil, with main writing credits going to Roger McKenzie and Frank Miller. That is what attracted me to this book. The acclaimed Frank Miller run I've heard so much about. I was going to read it on Marvel Unlimited, and then I discovered Epic Collections, and I went, well, I am currently existing in the slim time frame of existence in which they're publishing the Epic Collection that begins Frank Miller's run, and I can buy it for less than £300. Because yes, I'm quite late to the Epic Collections. For those of you who don't know, Epic Collections are a line of Marvel, I would say deluxe paperbacks, maybe compendium-esque comics, where it's usually like 400 to 500 pages long, and it collects, the general idea is it collects everything within a certain time period for that character. DC have just started doing this with their DC Finest books, but Marvel started this over a decade ago. And while Marvel Unlimited will obviously remain the more cost-efficient way in which to read old comics, and probably the way in which I predominantly do so, this is also a pretty cost-effective way in terms of physical collection to collect these physically. Do you get what I'm getting at? And Daredevil is one of my favourite characters in comics of all time, and I've read the Brian Michael Bendis run and all that kind of Volume 2 stuff, and yeah, I was like, well, what better way to start than to pick up this book, because it seems like Marvel have left some of the best for last, like Frank Miller on Daredevil. I've also heard good things about Walter Simonson on 4. That book is coming out in March, the beginning of his run. And so if I'm going to be late to the party, I might as well reap the benefits of still having money from not having bought all these previous books and spending them on some of the highlights which are just now coming out. Oh, I should also mention I'm a big fan of the Netflix Daredevil show, which is obviously no longer on Netflix but Disney Plus instead, and Daredevil Born Again season 1 was pretty cool too. So yeah, I'm just in general quite a big fan of a character, but I've yet to really acquaint myself with a Frank Miller side of his story arc. But this book does not begin with Frank Miller, it begins with Roger McKenzie, and I was a little dubious about picking up a Volume 8, because as we all know, while it is not important to be an encyclopedia reader of comics, I am essentially picking up a random issue, if you know what I mean. Like, this doesn't start with a big jumping on point for new readers. This starts in the middle of the Roger McKenzie run. Well, actually, I assume it's the middle. I don't know how long that run went on for. Maybe it's the tail end. Maybe it's all he ever wrote and I'm just being dumb. Actually, I have a spreadsheet for this. Let me check my handy-dandy spreadsheet I made for this. Okay, yeah, about halfway through is right. And I was concerned about two things. Firstly, that I wouldn't know what was happening, that I would be thrown into the middle of a storyline and there would be context that I didn't know about and it would be a problem. And secondly, I've not heard anyone really talk about Roger McKenzie's Daredevil run. Maybe people do and I just haven't heard them, but I was worried about maybe the Frank Miller's famous for revamping the character a bit and making Daredevil a beloved character, so what came before surely couldn't have been that great, right? Would it be really boring? Would it be difficult to get through? And I am pleased to report that on both counts, those concerns were unfounded. Firstly, while this undeniably just starts in the middle of Roger McKenzie's run, I found myself getting up to scratch with the story pretty quickly. There were some cast members who I'm not familiar with, and relationships were a bit jiggled up to what I'm used to, but I got the grasp of things pretty quick. I mean, this was back in the day when these comics were made to be picked up with any issue and have readers not feel like they were missing out on anything too important. And, when things became important, they would be very briefly rehashed in a way that didn't feel like it was taking too much out of a narrative. And secondly, as for the quality of the stories, while the Frank Miller stuff which comes afterwards is obviously better, the Roger McKenzie stuff was pretty fun too. I quite enjoyed it, and you had some appearances from interesting characters like the Hulk and Deathstalker. When is Deathstalker going to show up in the MCU? It's been a little while since I read the early stories in this book now, so forgive me if I don't remember all the details, but Deathstalker is one of Daredevil's previous villains who got stuck between life and death and kind of became this spooky ghost trenchcoat looking ass wearing man who could phase through things. And I don't know if he ever pops up again, because the way he's written is, he kind of meets an untimely end. Well, I guess it's not untimely if he was already supposed to be dead, but I'm sure he comes up again at some point. This is comics after all. But yeah, this is 1978, so this was just some good old Bronze Age fun. Nothing too, super dramatic or groundbreaking or anything like that, but I had a good time with these comics, and it's definitely kind of like loosened my concerns about picking up future epic collections which start in the middle of someone else's run or something like that, or someone who's not quite so famous or acclaimed of a writer. But a few issues into this book, Frank Miller appears not as a writer, but as an artist, and you can tell because suddenly the book looks a little bit different, and it's not like the art style is so drastically different, right? Marvel assumedly still had a house style, still had a way in which they wanted their characters to be drawn. And if I'm being honest, maybe this is just because I haven't read a lot of older, I guess, Epic Collection era books in comics in general, but I do struggle to differentiate between artists and art styles of this era compared to the modern era, for instance. I don't feel like the way, this might be sacrilege, I'm sorry, but I don't feel like the way that Frank Miller draws some of these characters is so unique and different and striking compared to the way like Mark Bagley draws compared to another modern era artist. But I'm not really an art critic, I don't really have an eye for it, so that's probably why I have this opinion. All the same though, I am developing an eye for it, and there were definitely some pages after Frank Miller started drawing the book that made me go, whoa, that's awesome. I particularly enjoyed one scene which was actually written by Roger McKenzie but drawn by Frank Miller, in which he was fighting Bullseye, who is in a very agitated state because we later learn he has a brain tumor. And Daredevil parries a bullet with his billy club. Like, he really has to focus to make sure he can do it, but he does it. And it's like one of the most awesome moments in this entire book, and it's not even written by Frank Miller. Although at this point, who knows what the collaborative effort was and what was weighed which way and all that. But yeah, Frank Miller eventually takes over writing the book, and it's obvious the second he does because the cover is just, Elektra is there, and the cover is very striking. And here's the weird, unexpected thing about this book. We're introduced to Elektra, and I'm like, okay, here we go. Frank Miller starting to write Daredevil, and Elektra's here, and I'm expecting all this stuff to kick off with Elektra. And we get this backstory about Elektra, and how she was an old love of Matt Murdock's, and she's now a mercenary, and they don't get on, and all this stuff. And then she kind of disappears for like 5 or 6 issues, or maybe more. Okay, looking back at the table of contents, maybe it's more like 4 issues, but it felt like a long time. It felt like we set up Elektra, and then we started focusing on the Kingpin. And if I had to point to a low point in this book, this might sound surprising, I would point to the Kingpin story, because it just wasn't all that interesting to me. I know it's Frank Miller written, but I was like, come on, let's get back to Elektra and let's introduce the hand and stick and all that stuff. And that stuff really does start to kick off towards the tail end of this book, and then it ends. So I guess I'll be waiting for volume 9. The Kingpin story wasn't bad, by the way. It was just, this is the first time Daredevil and the Kingpin meet, so a lot of the stuff that's so great about the Kingpin in Daredevil stories isn't quite there yet. That animosity, that underlying hatred, the fact that he knows his secret identity and can, twist his life around however he sees fit and all this stuff. It just isn't established yet, it isn't there yet, and while it is interesting to see them meet each other and fight for the first time, it's also kind of plain. Although I did like how it shook out in the end, with Kingpin basically selling out the lieutenants which betrayed him, and Matt having to take that as a win despite knowing he was doing what Kingpin wanted. That was the only time throughout that whole story that I really felt like I recognized the Kingpin as I know him, which is as this scarily competent, manipulative character. Beyond that, he kind of does just come across as a generic mob boss, so I guess his character hasn't been fleshed out all that much yet. Obviously, Vanessa is involved in this as well, and yeah, it is a little bit more interesting than generic mob boss, I should say, but just not quite what I was looking for in a Kingpin story. And then at the end of the book, we have a couple of bonus extras. We have one story which is a what-if story, and it's what if Matt Murdock became an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., written by Mike W. Barr and Frank Miller, and penciled by Frank Miller, and honestly, this one didn't do anything crazy for me, I guess because I'm not that big of an Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. guy in general. I did watch the first few seasons of a TV show and I enjoyed it, but as far as comics go, nothing about it really appeals to me, and so making Matt Murdock become an agent was a bit and the fact that it was obviously a single issue story, or maybe even part of a single issue story, I'm not quite sure how they published the what if stories back in the day. It does wrap up pretty quickly, and the story and the plot is a bit okay, alright, sure. Hydra were keeping tabs on Matt Murdock before he even got hit by the radiation that blinded him for some reason, and so immediately knew to go and kidnap his dad that he would have to go and rescue for some reason, and Nick Fury kept this a secret from Matt Murdock because he didn't want Matt Murdock to worry about his dad because he has the emotional maturity of a 12-year-old, I guess. It's just kind of a story where things happen. And then the material from Bizarre Adventures is a black and white Elektra story about one of the contracts she goes out on and the person who sent her out on it. And that was a really fun story, actually. I really enjoyed the little black and white story in the back there. I won't say too much about it, but yeah, there's a moment where you're like, ooh, and then she does something, you're like, okay, good. Okay, good. But it kind of examines Elektra as a character and her morals and just where she draws the line and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I really enjoyed this book. And yeah, you know I like to show you the books I review as well. Apologies for the dinginess. It is currently 1:30 in the afternoon, but I live in England and it is December, and this is just what we've been dealing with. Anyway, Daredevil, The Man Without Fear. I do think it's kind of a shame that the Epic Collection thing at the top here cuts off the logo. I wish they could have maybe like shifted the art down just a little bit, but maybe that wasn't possible. But anyway, to Daredevil, I haven't mentioned it yet, but the thing I find interesting about this is that this is an issue cover from Frank Miller's run, but this is an issue title from McKenzie's run, which I think is a pretty clever way of doing it. It kind of like immediately indicates to people who are familiar, or I guess intimately familiar with Daredevil's history, just what is included in this book, obviously besides just saying Mackenzie and Miller. But yeah, it's a really nice book. We've got the contents here, if anyone's interested in exactly what is collected in this book. These are the entirety of the contents. Oh, actually, hang on a minute. Yes, it is. I was confused because I saw Elektra down there and Elektra up there, but that is also the name of a Bizarre Adventures volume. But yeah, the book, obviously I'm just going to jump to the end. It's easier to flip through. But yeah, Frank Miller's art is wonderful, and I don't really have too much else to say about it that I haven't already said, other than just like, I really do love this format of comic book, like this nice chunky paperback book. And I think I'm definitely going to be getting more of these. In fact, I've got one that's probably like 2 or 3 stops away right now. I'll post a short when it gets here, but I'm also waiting on my very first compendium, which I will also post. I'll post them in the same short. I'll wait. But yeah, I'm back on the physical comics train, if you couldn't guess. I suppose I should show you the back as well, with volume 8 and the years it covers, and the art on the back here as well. For some reason, I never clocked that Dr. Octopus was on the back here because I was surprised when he showed up in the book. But yeah, there's a story with Dr. Octopus, and it's really fun to see how Daredevil deals with him, considering he doesn't have super strength or like a spider sense or anything like that. Although his radar kind of adjusts for not having a spider sense. But yeah, it's a fun tale. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about it. I hope that they release Volume 9 next instead of jumping ahead to 10 or 11, because I really do want to finish the Frank Miller run, and you know, I'm not exactly going to go out of my way and try and collect all of these. I'm not made of money, you know. And I'm about 10 years too late. I do hope they start reprinting the older ones. I mean, I know they do reprints occasionally, but I hope that when they've completed the Epic collections as a project, they spend time kind of redoing the project for people who hadn't done it before, if you know what I mean. Also, I wasn't able to get the Spider-Man 2099 omnibus because it kept going up in price between me being able to afford it. And so I really hope they do 2099 Epic collections at some point. That's a tangent. Anyway, I'm going to go. Thanks for checking out this review. Let me know what you thought down below if you like. Subscribe for more, like the video if you liked it, and I will catch you in whatever I make next.